Hey guys, it's Nils, and thank you for taking the time to view my beginner's video on photography. Today's video is going to only cover the basics, but hopefully it'll provide a solid foundation that you can then utilize to further your knowledge of photography later on. The cell phone camera. One of the most recognizable and widely used features of modern-day cell phones are their cameras. These cameras take quality pictures, are very portable, and most importantly, are easy to use. With all their impressive credentials, one might wonder if cell phones have completely replaced the need for conventional cameras. Well, I am here to tell you that they have not. The true potential of photography really lies in the cameras that are more difficult to use, such as SLR cameras, in which there are many different dynamics that come together in order to create the perfect picture. So in this video, one of my main goals is to introduce to you some of the most important dynamics that are involved in taking pictures manually, which means that the camera does not decide all the settings for you, and you have to do it on your own based off of intuition and experience. And hopefully in the end, this video inspires you to go out and take pictures and want to learn even more about photography. The internet, for instance, is a great resource to use. There are tons of web pages available on subjects of photography. There are videos available on YouTube which cover things that I simply can't cover in this video. So feel free to utilize the internet. It's a great resource for learning, and I hope in the meantime you enjoy this video and get something out of it. So before I cover the topics in this video, I thought that it would be worthwhile to just go over the basics of your typical SLR camera. An SLR camera, such as this one right here, is comprised of two different parts. You have the lens and then you have the body of the camera. In an SLR camera, light enters in through the lens and then bounces off of a series of mirrors until it exits through the eyepiece of the camera. This gives the viewer an extremely accurate representation of what the picture will look like after it has been taken. Located behind the primary mirror of all SLR cameras is an image sensor which has replaced the conventional use of film. Looking back at an internal diagram of an SLR camera, you can see that the primary mirror, shown as a blue line, flips up and out of the way, which allows light to be recorded on the sensor. Generally, the cost of a camera is dependent upon how big of a sensor you have and how well it adapts to different scenarios of light. This is one area of photography in which cell phone cameras have a major disadvantage against SLR cameras. The size of the sensor allows more light to be collected, and since cell phones are so small, they will never have a sensor larger than that found on an SLR camera. Let's now look at our first topic of this video, which is ISO. All sensors, whether in cell phone cameras or in SLR cameras, are able to have their sensitivity to light adjusted. Since SLR cameras have larger image sensors, they are able to pick up light better and their ISO can be adjusted more. You want the ISO in a camera to be as low as possible because as you increase the ISO, you get this effect within pictures called noise. Let's take a look at this picture of the Eiffel Tower. As you can see on the left, the sky is uniform and smooth because it has a very low ISO, while on the right, the sky has all these little dots, which are referred to in photography as noise. The lighting situation that you're in kind of dictates what ISO you're allowed to use. If you're outside in a very sunny environment, you want to keep the ISO as low as possible to reduce the noise effect. However, if you're taking photography at night, for instance, you may have no choice but to raise the ISO higher. So in the case of nighttime photography or photography in dark rooms, There are actually ways of getting around taking pictures with high levels of noise. However, I will cover this a little bit later on in the video. For now, it's important to remember that the higher the ISO, the more noise a picture will have. Also, it's usually a good idea to keep your camera's ISO settings in automatic when you're first starting out photography, because don't forget that your camera has light sensors within it that can very quickly choose the appropriate ISO depending on what kind of situation you're in. That being said, don't hesitate to try ISO on your own. One of the first things that I did when I started photography is that I would put the ISO setting in automatic, and then I would try to guess which ISO the camera was going to use in the picture that I was taking. Once the camera took the picture, I would then pull up the information and compare my results with the results of the camera. And as you continue to take more and more pictures, you get better at guessing what ISO should be used in certain scenarios. Okay, so now let's get into the topic of shutter speed. A camera shutter is essentially a device which dictates how much light the sensor of the camera is exposed to during a picture. So if you have a really short shutter speed, then that means that the sensor is only exposed to light for a very, very short amount of time. And this works well when you are outside, for instance, and the sun is shining and you really don't need the sensor to be exposed to that much light. The opposite end of the spectrum is, of course, a very long shutter speed in which the shutter allows the sensor to gradually be exposed to light over a long period of time. In still scenes, long exposures bring out the colors in objects that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye. This is all due to the fact that this light is being collected over time. However, in moving objects, such as a picture of this freeway, you can see that the car's lights have been turned into streaks. This is due to the fact that they are moving. These pictures offer an excellent segue into the next thing that I wanted to mention about shutter speed, which is that shutter speed influences the way that a picture looks when objects are in movement. A great example of where shutter speed plays a huge role in an image is with hummingbirds. In this picture, in order to freeze frame the hummingbird's wings, a very short shutter speed needed to be used. Now here's an example of a hummingbird in which the picture was taken with a longer shutter speed. And sure enough, as you can see, the wings of the hummingbird are flapping too quickly in order for the camera to freeze frame them. Now that we've covered the topics of shutter speed and ISO separately, it's also very important to talk about how ISO and shutter speed interact with each other in order to allow cameras to be versatile in many different situations. So remember earlier on that I said that you want your ISO to be as low as possible, and that still remains true. However, now that we have also introduced the topic of objects in movement, or objects that are in low light, I want to add to that statement about ISO and say that you want to keep your ISO as low as possible as long as the situation allows it. There will be certain situations, however, in which you have no choice but to raise the ISO in order to compensate for a very fast shutter speed. And a great example of this is if you're trying to take a picture of a moving object in lower levels of light. So remember that in order to capture moving objects, you need to have a quick shutter speed that is fast enough to freeze frame their movement in the picture. However, quicker shutter speeds also expose the sensor of a camera to light for a shorter period of time. So in order to compensate for this, you would have to increase the sensitivity of your camera sensor so that it can still properly expose the scene even though it's being exposed to light for a very short amount of time. The last subject that we're going to cover in this video is aperture. An aperture is an opening within the lens of your camera that can expand or contract, and this expansion and contraction affects the depth of field of focus. So there are pictures such as this one in which you can see that this flower that is closer to me is in focus while the plants behind it are out of focus. This is known in photography as a very short depth of field. It is not necessarily talking about which part of the image is in focus. It's just referring to how much of the image is in focus when you have objects in the foreground and then in the background. Larger depth of field is able to bring objects in the foreground and in the background into focus. So here's an example of a picture that I've taken of just a fence. And in this first picture, you can see that there's a very short depth of field. You might also notice that the second vertical post closest to me is in focus, while the other vertical posts behind it and the closest vertical post to me is not in focus. This is characteristic of a short depth of field. Now here's the same picture, but it has been taken with an increased depth of field. The focal point remains the same. However, as you can see, almost the entire fence has been put into focus. This is characteristic of a large depth of field. In photography, aperture is represented by something called f-stops. And f-stops range depending on which kind of lens you're using, but it's just important to remember that smaller f-stops, such as f1.4 or f3.6, have very short depth of fields, while very large f-stops have much longer depth of fields. Aperture not only affects depth of field, but it also affects how much light is able to enter into the camera. So that means that it also is another factor that affects exposure. And I think the best way to describe this is if you think of the human eye. In settings where there is a deficit of light, your pupils expand in order to allow as much light into your eye as possible. Where in situations where there is excessive amounts of light, your pupils contract. Here's where aperture becomes a little tricky. The dilation of the opening within the lens is inversely related to the f-stop number. Here is a visual representation to help demonstrate what I'm trying to say. In this picture, you can see that f-stops with very small values have actually very wide dilations within the lens, while f-stops with very high values actually have very small openings within their lens. Although aperture can be very confusing, it's also one of the most useful tools in photography to really bring out the artsiness of your photos. Portraits, for instance, are an excellent example of where aperture is very useful because generally a viewer's eyes will pan to what is in focus within a picture. As a result, professional portraits of people usually blur the background so that the viewer's eye naturally pans to the subject, which is of course the person in the photo. Well, everyone, I hope that you enjoyed my video and learned something new about photography. Remember, this video only covered the very basics of photography, and there is a lot more out there to be learned, but this is hopefully a good foundation for which you can then explore other areas of photography that are more advanced. And remember, photography is something that anyone can do. You don't need a camera that is thousands and thousands of dollars to take great pictures. And I really hope that you get out there and capture some amazing memories. Thank you.